Hello, friends. It's time to read another chapter of God's Grace Keeps Pace. And we're already to chapter 20, and there's only 23 chapters. So I'm getting pretty close to finishing her up. Chapter 20 is the anchor holds. And the scripture is Isaiah 45:3. I will give you treasures hidden in the darkness, secret riches. I will do this so you may know that I am the Lord, the God of Israel, the one who calls you by name. The spring of 2000 dawned with more heartache than I thought I could bear. In March, my oldest brother Wayne died suddenly of a heart attack. I still remember receiving that call and finding it hard to believe. My sister Linda was diagnosed with a recurrence of melanoma only 6 months after Wayne died. She was instantly thrown into a vicious fight for her life. The day I received her sad news, I was standing beside Jan's bed at the Children's Center. I was already crying. I just found out that we were going to have to move Jan to an adult nursing center when Linda called. I was doubly devastated. 2000 was certainly turning out to be a rough year. Jan's 1994 placement at the Pediatric Nursing Center had blindsided me, but hindsight had allowed me to see that it was a wonderful blessing for both Jan and me. I'd grieved her absence from our home, but I'd continued to be an integral part of her care at the Children's Center. I wasn't prepared for her to move into an adult facility that was far from me. Coupled with the loss of my brother, 2 surgeries myself, and a move from our home of 20 years, I was struggling emotionally already. With the news of my sister's battle and Jan's move, I was just a mess. This move came because of another federal government mandate that required that all children 21 years and older be removed from the Pediatric Nursing Center. Jan would turn 21 in January. That meant we had to find an adult nursing facility for her. I already knew that when any of our critical care children left the care of the center, they averaged only living 6 months, unless they had gone to Corn, Oklahoma. Corn was a tiny town in western Oklahoma. He had a post office and an old building that at times was open for coffee and sandwiches. That was about all was there. It was almost a 2-hour drive from her home. The thought of Jan being so far away seemed just inconceivable to me. But I searched and I found there was only a handful of facilities near us that would take a patient as young as Jan, and particularly one as critical care as Jan. I learned which ones were willing, and then I made no appointments, but visited unannounced at odd times of the day. And that's, by the way, if you're thinking about a nursing facility for a loved one, don't visit announced, visit unannounced, because I knew people that had visited this one center announced, and it looked really good when they went in. I visited it unannounced at an odd time of the day and thought it was terrible. I also learned that I could look up nursing homes online on a federal site and find their ratio of nurses to patients and their ratings and check for bad reviews. It confirmed what I found at that nursing home that I visited unannounced. That site helped me greatly in my decision making. As far as I know, that is still available if you're considering nursing home care. It was just a wonderful site. I was told about one facility that was only about 2 miles from our home. I checked their reviews and their inspections were very good. I visited it unannounced and was impressed with their facility. It was clean and well staffed, but they had no openings. They put us on a waiting list, but gave us very little encouragement. It was the only adult facility I found acceptable. I cried my way through the others, knowing I could not trust Jan's care to them. One place that I thought looked pretty good, I walked through one more time, and then I noticed that there were chains around every chest of drawer and all the bedside tables in the room. I missed that the first time through because I was busy looking at other things. And so I asked about that. I said, why are all these chains on the bedside tables and the chest of drawers? And they said, oh, we have a terrible theft problem here. We have to keep everything locked up. And because things disappear. Well, Jan had tape player, tapes, all kinds of things. I couldn't see how you could lock all that up. And besides that, if someone was willing to steal the elderly people's underwear and all of their things, I didn't trust them to take care of Jan. I'd been in a car wreck in 1997 by then, and I had 5 ruptured discs in my back, so I could no longer lift Jan, or I would have just brought her home. That would have been a simple solution, but I couldn't do it. So one fall day in 2000 found my sweet daughter-in-law Stephanie and I following in an ambulance to Corn, Oklahoma. I sat in the back seat of the car with our 2000 July blessing, 4-month-old grandson Jack, and I cried much of the way. I really was a mess, particularly when I saw how far off I-40 Corn, Oklahoma was. It seemed we were driving to the middle of nowhere. I couldn't understand, and I'm ashamed to say I questioned God greatly, and I grieved. Yet another unwanted change. Would I ever learn that I could always trust his heart? That again, much of the time, the unwanted change would turn out to be a blessing. Amazingly, much of Mike's drilling that he was doing for a major client moved to the area around where Jan moved. Those oil leases had been leased for many years, so God knew this already. I just didn't know it. Because the nursing home was in an isolated area, they provided 2-bedroom suites at their facility for families of their patients to rent so they could visit. They were nice and equipped with a fully furnished kitchen, and they only charged $20 a night. We rented one of those apartments almost every week and stayed 1 or 2 nights. We could roll Jan down to her room and let her hang out with us. Mike and I spent much quality time together and with Jan because the distance he normally drove daily ate up enormous amounts of his time. And this little apartment was so nice that we even were able, when my mom visited, to take her. It was a 2-bedroom apartment, take her with us. She got to see Jan, or if Ben and Stephanie went with us, they got to see Jan. So it really was a blessing. We found out why the care was so excellent, too. Many of the aides and nurses were from surrounding Mennonite farm communities. Jan lived there for over 2 years. One of my memories is that when 9/11 occurred, I was driving back from Corn on I-40 after having spent a couple of days there. I remember listening intently to the developing saga as I drove. Another precious memory is talking to my sister on the long drive back from Corn. She died in March of 2001. Jan's care at Corn was so excellent that I felt comfortable to fly to Alabama and spend the last week of Linda's life taking care of her at the hospital in Birmingham, Alabama. That was a blessing. 2002, Jan became very ill and she was sent to a small hospital in Weatherford, Oklahoma. After a week there, she was transferred to Baptist Hospital in Oklahoma City. She was placed under the care of a pulmonary specialist. She was in that hospital for a total of 50 days. After I'd sat behind her in her hospital bed 24 hours a day for over 20 days, once again, I was so exhausted that I could barely stand. I was coming to the end of my strength and my ability once again. I cried out to God for help. And the next morning, as I read my Bible, he answered. He gave me a scripture that said he'd send help from his sanctuary. I didn't know what that meant because we'd recently moved. We were in a new church. We knew few people there. Besides, Jan was now 24 years old. She was almost more than I could handle, and I was accustomed to taking care of her. I wondered how anyone could help. But as always, God's grace kept pace. My friend Gay called, and her sister Fran, the one that took me to Kenneth Hagin's healing school, the one who is a nurse, wanted to drive from Lawton and take a couple of nights with Jan so I could rest. I was amazed. Keep in mind that this was the time when Facebook or social media, before Facebook or social media. So these people coming together had to be God. One of Jan's original babysitters from the early years of life, Angie Yeager Culbertson, called, and she wanted to take a few nights. She drove from Owasso, Oklahoma. Gay wanted to take a few nights. She drove from Dallas. Stephanie insisted on taking a few nights, even though she was pregnant. And so I had help from the sanctuary, even though it was across the country sanctuary. He mobilized his saints to help a tired mom and a little girl who were in desperate need. I went home and showered and slept in my own bed. Without their sacrificial gift of love, I don't think I would have been able to handle that 50 days Jan was in the hospital. Those sweet saints had answered his nudge with love and care, and they became his sanctuary of provision for Jan and me. During that time, it became necessary for the doctor to do a tracheotomy on Jan so she could breathe. That was not something we ever wanted to have happen, but she was struggling to catch her breath. And with that trach, we knew Jan could no longer live in Corn because they did not take trach patients. I cried out to God. I didn't know what we were going to do. I had no idea where Jan would be able to go. The places before we chose Corn were limited, and that was without the trach. With a trach, it would be nearly impossible to find a good place for Jan. I talked to the specialist about our predicament before he ever did the surgery, and he said, "Is there any place you would like to have Jan at?" And I said, "Well, yes, we've been on a waiting list at Oklahoma Christian Home in Edmond for over 2 years, but they've never called us back. It's only 2 miles from our home." He smiled broadly and he said, "Well, I just happen to have gone to high school with the chief administrator there. He is one of my very best friends. Let me give him a call." He picked up the phone, called, and incredibly, Jan became the first 24-year-old with a trach and a feeding tube ever accepted as a resident. What are the odds of us getting the one doctor who knew the head administrator of the only facility we were interested in? That's got to be God's grace. Jan moved 2 miles from our home, was placed on hospice. Shockingly, only 2 weeks later, Mike found a knot under his arm, and this was such a shock. Psalm 31:15a, "My times are in thy hands." That's a scripture that Corrie ten Boom used to quote all the time. And it was a scripture that gave me great peace because I knew this knot did not blindside God. It blindsided us, but I knew it didn't blindside God. And so I knew that he would make a way, and he did. God's grace keeping pace. When you're blindsided by life, keep looking for those glimpses of God tucked in your hard places. They're always there. He sent us help from the sanctuary when we had no idea how he could provide. He did it. God gave us eyes to see the hugs. God, give us eyes to see the hugs you send in our difficult places of life. Let us glimpse your graces. They are always there. And I believe that wholeheartedly, that God's graces, his provision for his children, they're always there. Sometimes it takes hindsight to look back and see it, but God's grace, he's just faithful. And so that's the end of chapter 20. Next one is chapter 21, It Is Well With My Soul. And I can tell you these last two chapters are going to be hard for me to read. They were hard for me to write. And so bless you if you're one that's following along and listening. And I thank you for that. See you